just give a brief introduction to, and first of all, welcome to Dr. Johnson, who says she prefers to be called Nina. So we want to welcome Nina. She is an assistant professor of sociology at Swarthmore's Sociology and Anthropology Department, and also in the program of Black Studies. And just looking through, she has a number of areas that she's involved with, interests. And one of them is, politics, culture, and also something, carceral policy, which basically is the legal, the word, I guess, incarceration comes from that. She studies that as well. And she's also part of the Chester think tank and the Greaterford think tank, which is a group of scholars who study the criminal justice system and also try to be a bridge and have conversations between those who are imprisoned or part of the criminal justice system and those outside. So, so as I said to Nina before, that we are trying as an organization, she's aware of what we do, how we're trying to basically say and demonstrate that Black Lives Matter and the various concerns of systemic racism as well. So we're trying to have that begin to permeate our organization, sort of colleague to colleague, but also in the work that we do with our students to try to find a way to integrate that into our curriculum and in the way we interact with each other and with the larger community. So this is the second presentation that we're going to be having, and we're trying to educate ourselves and learn. And I told Nina, I keep saying Dr. Johnson, Nina, that basically she'll present for about maybe 45 minutes or so. And then afterwards we'll have about 10, 15 minutes of question and answer afterwards. And then that'll be followed, we'll do a debrief afterwards. And we're gonna record this session, okay? So I wanna turn, Robert, any comments or anything? You wanna say anything?
No, nothing at all.
Okay.
Happy Friday.
Oh, happy Friday. Okay, good. So we're going to record this, and I turn the floor over to Nina. And everybody just give her a welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Hello.
I'm sorry, I forgot. One more shameless plug. I want to thank the Swarthmore's Lang Center for Civic Responsibility for sponsoring this presentation. Thank you.
All right, so I'm gonna jump into it pretty quickly. And what I'm grateful for first is to be invited and be able to speak with you all this morning. Thank you so much for having me. I'm gonna be talking about systemic racism and Black liberation in 2020. Every time I say that, I can't believe what year it is. So thank you for having me. I would like to start with just some acknowledgements of where we are right now and a little overview of the talk. I think it's always good to know what you're getting into. So what we're going to cover in this brief talk today, again, start with some acknowledgements of where we are right now, how we got here, what it'll take to change things in this nation for us to achieve the more fair, just, equitable society we're looking for, and what we can do, I think, is both individuals and community members and in our local spaces. So I'll start with a quote by James Baldwin, who is my favorite and probably everyone's favorite. He says, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And so what I would like to start with is acknowledging both our shared humanity and the difficult time we're all living in. My condolences to all of us in this space who've lost someone during this pandemic, who have ourselves or have had loved ones become ill, who are experiencing economic hardship, who are experiencing increased fear and anxiety. I just want to start with that I see you, I understand, and we're in this together. You have support, you have care, and I'm breathing with you this morning because this is not an easy time. I want to acknowledge also that we're on Lenape lands, where I am in Philadelphia, and also in Pennsylvania, there are the Iroquois, Erie, Muncie, and Shawnee. Whenever we're going to talk about race in America, we have to start with people who originated here and whose lands we are on. We honor them, they are still alive, they're still with us, and that means we have work to do around making sure their lives are supported and they have everything they need. Indigenous nations and communities are especially vulnerable during this pandemic, so I want to recognize that. I also recognize all of us who are part of social categories that are especially vulnerable during this political moment. Those born outside of the US, those of us who are queer and transgender, those of us who are followers of non-Protestant faith traditions, those of us who are folks of color, those of us who are elderly and young. This is a difficult, difficult time. But we're in this together. And we're gonna breathe together this morning, okay? So in my work, I do a lot of talking about inequality. Class, gender, sexuality, religion, immigration status, all of these different categories, and the ways we're slotted into different positions in society based on these categories. How we have differential access to power and resources based on these categories, and how we have different consequences for the same behavior based on these categories. And one of the things I found is that race is a particularly difficult conversation to have. So I want to start with, how do we talk about race? How do we have a conversation about race? And I think the first piece of it for me comes from John Jackson at University of Pennsylvania. He's the dean of the School of Communications, he's a documentary filmmaker and a scholar of race. And he says we actually have to be sure we want to be in a conversation. A lot of us just want someone to be standing there and to co-sign whatever we say. We actually don't want to be in a conversation. And so first we have to decide we want to be in a conversation, and then we have to realize that the goal of a conversation is understanding. That the goal is not to win the argument, but to understand. And so I'm not here to make a speech and have you guys co-sign what I say, or silently agree in an echo chamber, but to listen, to offer up my thoughts and to listen to yours. And for us to be in a conversation, and in a sustained conversation, we have to be willing to lose the argument so that the conversation can continue, so that we continue to be a community. So let's begin to listen to each other with the goal of understanding. And so setting that intention today is what I hope to do as we get started. All right, so let's move on to the meat. Where are we? In 2020, I'm sure all of us have asked at some point, where are we? What planet is this? What is happening here? There's so many things that are going on that it seems like we have whiplash day to day. But one of the things I want to focus on particularly are all of these indicators of health and well-being and where we are racially. So in COVID-19, as we're thinking about health and healthcare, that's really the most pressing part of our what we're thinking about these days and what's on our minds and hearts and what's facing us. That COVID-19 cases and deaths are disproportionately higher in communities with larger Black populations. Contributing to these poor outcomes is the far greater likelihood in Black and Latino Americans live in poverty and reside in neighborhoods with overcrowded households, air pollution, all kinds of environmental factors, and inadequate access to healthcare. Most likely to be in jobs where they have to go out during this time and are not allowed to work from home like many of us are allowed to do. There are the folks who are delivering our food and groceries and packaging our goods at Amazon for us to receive them at home. Beyond the physical toll of what's happening with COVID is this economic recession we're in, that millions are out of jobs, that over 8 million people have moved below the poverty line since this pandemic started. That 8 million more people living in poverty in the United States right now, disproportionately Black and Latinx population, and Indigenous. And what we're looking at is the people who are already economically disadvantaged moving further into disadvantage. What we're also seeing is unemployment and underemployment. So unemployment has shot up during this time, underemployment, so folks who are working every week but not working enough hours or making enough money to live on. People who are in the gig economy where they're working without medical benefits, without the kinds of supports it would take to live and live well. And because benefits are tied to jobs, most likely, because we don't have a sort of public option for healthcare, if you lose your job, you often lose your benefits and don't have access to healthcare. In this moment of high unemployment and underemployment, that's exacerbating people's health outcomes. People have less access to mental health access. Right now, we're showing all of these ways in which death by despair, so alcoholism, drug addiction, suicide, all of these numbers are up during the pandemic, disproportionately folks who are already suffering, again, low-income folks, folks of color. And then when we think about housing insecurity is a huge issue right now. In Philadelphia, there was a real extraordinarily successful social movement over the summer of unhoused folks who demanded from the city all of these empty houses that they could be using, and got over 50 homes in a land trust that has to be publicly distributed. And so there is a real fight around housing insecurity. We know there's a great text by Matthew Desmond, Evicted, that shows us that housing insecurity, housing instability, it really determines our access to schooling for our kids, our ability to keep an address and keep a job. All of these things are determined by our housing. And in a city like Philadelphia, where I live, we have enough housing to house everybody, and we just don't have the political will to do it. And so that, again, disproportionately impacts people of color, especially Black folks. So again, that's tied to education. Who has access to K-12 education determines who has good access to higher ed. And all of the programming, we're seeing disproportionately that those who are dropping out of college right now are those who are, again, already economically distressed. There is an upshot in predatory for-profit colleges right now that target Black and brown folks disproportionately, who don't end up graduating but incur a lot of debt. The K-12 experience for particularly Black and Latinx public school students, they don't have good access to computers, even though they are trying to get more access for students. They may not have access to Wi-Fi, which means they're not getting their education right now, which is going to push them further back. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about assets and wealth, because I think we often miss that income is one measure, but wealth is a completely different measure, which means that when you have a kind of economic recession and you have no wealth to back up your income, should you lose it, that means whatever ground you've gained economically is completely lost. And we saw that in the last recession of 2008, that the median wealth of Black women was $56,000 before that last housing recession. After, the median wealth of Black women was $600. So that echoes over generations. White women lost a lot in that last housing recession too, and that's one of the things we don't talk about, is the intersection of race and gender, and how particularly women-headed households who have gained ground economically are the first to lose it. That's an important thing to understand, that loss of wealth and how it impacts for generations, and that loss of assets. Around prisons and policing, we see this outcry around policing and police brutality and the differential ways that people are treated in terms of the use of force, in terms of the amount of arrests, in terms of the amount of policing by neighborhood. And certainly when we think about adjudication, those who are sentenced, there are longer sentences for the same crime if you are Black or Latinx. And certainly we can look at immigration detention. There's so many ways in which every indicator shows us we are an unequal nation that offers unequal protection and unequal consequences to people based on their racial category. So the next question is, how did we get here, right? How did we end up in a society where everything is so incredibly unequal? I'm sorry, my computer is freezing. Okay. Go back. So how did we get here? And I'm going to spend a lot of time on this piece of it, just because I want to really demonstrate how systems work. And I think sometimes when we talk about racial inequality, we get stuck in the realm of feelings, attitudes, interpersonal behavior, and talk about racism as a set of behaviors that can be corrected. That if we would just be kinder, gentler to each other, or be in proximity and relationship with each other, we could eradicate systems and structures, which is not the case. We actually have to attack policy. And so I want to show you my lovely graphic here. I don't know what just happened. I'm sorry. Okay, are you guys still seeing the slide? Just give me a thumbs up. Okay, perfect. Okay. So this process I stole from Manning Marable and added onto it a little bit. He's a historian. But basically it looks like this. We instantiate an unequal system, right? when we look at the institution of slavery in the United States. To build wealth in the United States and to build a capitalist system, we have to have exploitation, right? That is built into the system of capitalism. Someone must be exploited, someone must work and make less for their work than the person who owns the means of production, right? So we instantiate this unequal system. Human beings, there's something about human beings that always resist oppression, that always resist domination. So there is this resistance. And when that resistance reaches a tipping point that disrupts the social order cannot keep going. We cannot keep going as it is. When that resistance reaches that tipping point, a concession must be made by those in power, right? We got to give them something so that we can keep the engine of society going. Once that concession is made, though, for those in power, for those who are wanting to uphold the social order, there's a backlash to that concession. Even though the concession is not what necessarily is demanded by those who are oppressed, that concession still elicits a backlash, right? That backlash then demands of the social order to re-entrench whatever system of inequality there was. And we can look at sharecropping as a reinstantiation of this re-entrenchment of the social order after slavery, right? We can look at the slave codes, the Black codes, as a re-entrenchment of the white supremacist social order after slavery, right? And we can look at the ways in which that was brokered, right, in 1876 between the North and the South to maintain the Union, right? To say the federal government will no longer offer protection to Black homeowners. The federal that gained this land from the Freedmen's Bureau. The federal government will no longer support African-American senators who were elected during Reconstruction, right? We had more senators post-Civil War than Black senators than we do now. And that concession, that backlash, right, from the South and the North to having Black senators, Black power brokers, Black landowners is really what brokered that re-entrenchment, right? So let's go to the next slide. I often talk about these things as abstract, and what I've figured out is that we need to see these are human beings, right? So I'm going to start with my own family, Okolona, Mississippi. This is where my mother's family is from. It is the little city that does big things, and it is tiny, and you have never heard of it because it's a very small place, but it is in Mississippi. This is the land, and you can see the little house in the background. It's over 100 acres in Mississippi, so I'm going to use my little pointer. So there's the little house. It's a teeny house. There's 100 acres in Mississippi, and it stands, and it's been in our family since post-emancipation. And the reason it is here is because we understand Mississippi as a family, and no one at this point wants to live there, but we keep it as an option, and we hold on to the land. This is my great-great-grandmother. Her name is Maggie Parchman Dobbs, and she was born in 1862, born enslaved. This is her daughter, Jenny Whitfield, my great-grandmother, and my mother's grandmother. And she was born in 1862 and enslaved on the Parchman Plantation, which is now a prison. And that's why her name was Parchman. And she and her husband bought this land after they married before the turn of the century. And again, that is the same land I just showed you that has stayed in our family and been defended by shotgun. There's another shot of her, which I don't show because people find a bit of offense with her with a shotgun, but she stayed up all night to protect this land after her husband died, and people constantly came to take it and passed it down to her daughter. And my grandmother, who is not pictured here, these are my grandmother's sisters, my great aunts. And we're gonna go to the next slide. And again, we think about slavery and abolition, we can think about Reconstruction, convict leasing, Black codes, and sharecropping as, again, a backlash to the end of slavery and a reinstantiation of a white supremacist system encoded in law. And we'll see that over and over again in the course of history in the United States. This is my grandmother, Josie Whitfield White. She was born in 1924. And her mother, Jenny Whitfield, was married, to her father, who also died. And again, what's interesting about my family on my mother's side is that I never know how the men in the family died. Some went to war, others, they definitely just don't discuss their deaths. But it's hard to know how they died or when they died, because that's not part of the family story. It's just that they died. So my grandmother went to college at Okolona College, and on that land that they bought and kept, they had a school and for the little kids. And my grandmother taught there. After she finished Okolona College, she went off again to Bethel College, where she had to start over because they wouldn't accept credits from a Black college. Then when Bethel College lost their accreditation, she moved to Indiana for a better life for her children in 1956. And though Indiana University would not accept her credits, so she had to start her undergraduate degree again for the third time, and kept persisting. That's often a story that's told as a story of resilience. And what it is a story of white supremacy, right? And the ways in which people are kept out, no matter how much they try. And so around that time, Black folks are really thinking about how do we become citizens, right? And education was one aspect of that striving. Another aspect was participation in the military as a way to prove fitness for citizenship. And this is a bunch of soldiers coming home from World War I. And here Du Bois says, we return from fighting, we return fighting. In 1919, as soldiers are returning from home, from war, demonstrating their fitness for citizenship, their participation in the American project. That is the summer of 1919 that's called Red Summer. They come home from war ready to participate fully in society as citizens, and there is an extreme backlash of violence and many, many lynchings of men in uniform who come home. Those who try to begin, and this is really the start of the Great Migration from the South to the North, those who try to build homes. Because we often think of sort of racial terror and violence as happening in the South. This is Chicago in 1919, a group of vigilante white men searching for Black folks on the South Side who they can terrorize and push out of neighborhoods in extra legal violence. This is a group of children around a home that's been burned out, a family that's been displaced in Chicago. Again, backlash to any kind of resistance to an oppressive social order. Here we have A. Philip Randolph, who organized the original March on Washington, which was meant to happen in the early 1940s, as making demands on President Roosevelt to both desegregate the military and desegregate the armed forces and anybody working in and around the armed forces because of the kinds of participation being demanded at the start of World War II. There were demands to desegregate. That march never happened because President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802, which prohibited discrimination in the defense industry and anybody who had a federal contact. Again, it didn't stick, but it was made. A. Philip Randolph was also the originating founder of the first large labor union of Blacks, the sleeping car porters. This was 1925. This was a huge union and another way in which Blacks resisted systemic racism, exclusion, from the ability to organize around labor, better working conditions to ensure their own safety. This was a huge union. This is their meeting in 1933, one of the largest in the nation. Again, organizing around labor and work, education, participation in the military in order to secure their place in society and resist this really harsh terror of white supremacy. Here we have the move to the North. So again, folks escaping racial terror in small rural towns, lynchings that happened over and over again to maintain the social order and to displace Black people who were landowners and farmers. And anytime they would move up, that terror rained down. So folks started to move to the North and into cities. That was the case with my mother's family and my father's family. I mentioned that my grandmother moved her 5 children to the North to Indiana in 1956. This is my dad. He was 9 years old, and his family moved from Pontotoc, Mississippi to Indiana, and they moved before he was born. So he was born in South Bend, Indiana. South Bend is another place no one's ever heard of unless you've heard of Notre Dame University. It's basically a town built around a Notre Dame University, and that's all there is Notre Dame. So this is my mom, this little cutie. Oops, I'm gonna go back one. It's my mom. She had just moved to Indiana, and one thing I think is important about it is that she she remembers the first thing she did when she moved to Indiana was to go to the public library, because they were not allowed to go to the public library, right? So these aren't long ago stories. My mother is alive. I mean, she has told me this many times, and how excited they were to go to the library. Because they just couldn't engage in public spaces in Mississippi. And even then, how difficult that was, because Indiana wasn't a bastion of sort of family love between the races, but they were allowed to go to public spaces. What was happening then when my parents were in Indiana and moving to different places along with millions of Black folks was a real push for desegregation of public accommodations. And here we all know about the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, which is happening around the same time. This is one of the buses where Black folks said, we are no longer going to pay for these services where we are discriminated against. And here is a bus, one of the buses that was traveling, and shows that there was one person on the bus. So there was a real economic hit and a real demand on the system, but it was a real sacrifice. Right? So here are domestic workers who are standing and waiting for rides to their work. One of the untold story of domestic workers in the South, of which my grandmother was one, as she was trying to restart her college degree again in Indiana. She worked as a domestic. There was something called paramour rights. And this was the right of any white man to have sexual relations unconsensual with any Black woman in his employ. They're called paramour rights. And that was not ended until very late in the 20th century, because a Black woman killed her employer who was sexually assaulting her regularly. So again, this is a set of rights that said you don't have a right to your own body, right? And this is a group of domestic workers who were regularly subject to harassment, assault in their workplaces, and had no legal recourse, but who are sacrificing their time and energy to walk to work and or to wait for rides so that they can participate in making demands on a system that offers them no protection. Here again is folks walking. It was a whole year of that Montgomery bus boycott. In inclement weather, it didn't matter. People stood up for that. And I think that's an important, again, piece of this, is that people are constantly resisting. It was also happening in terms of local sit-ins in the 1950s. Here's Racine, Washington, Racine, Wisconsin, excuse me, a very small town where people are, again, putting themselves, their bodies on the line to resist white supremacy. The larger movements we know of, here the March on Washington in DC for jobs and justice, it was a movement, but I wanted to show some of these smaller movements because people were organizing regularly in their small towns, right? So we had this sense that there was this narrative of America from slavery to Martin Luther King to Obama, but it required so much on the part of Black folks in every part of the country to resist regularly, organized, collective, to resist at the individual level over and over again. And so I want to really lift that up, and that these marches on Washington were organized over and over again, that there were always people working, organizations at work, individuals at work. So what we're talking about here is a constant struggle, right? And so here are my parents in the 1960s. Well, actually, the early 70s. That's me. My mom was very slim, so you can't tell that little bubble in there is me. And she is at Niagara Falls having a wonderful time because my parents did a secondary migration from Indiana to upstate New York after college for work. My mom went to Howard. My dad went to Indiana University. And my dad came to work for Xerox. And so they met in high school. My mom was my dad's sister's best friend. And so that's how they met. And they both needed after school jobs. And my dad was 3 years older and he was out of high school and in college. And they went to clean his apartment after a party. That's how my parents met. And my mother somehow, even though his house was a mess and he was too much partying, she fell in love with him and they got married. So thank God, because here I am. And there I am in her tummy. So they, like many others, moved again for work. They participated fully in what America said: if you just go to college, if you just get a job, if you just work hard, you will have a good life. My parents did that. They were very much a part of social movements. They were both in the Black Power movement, certainly participated in the Civil Rights movement when they were young, participated in marches. And they were really very much about moving Black folks forward because they had both the personal experiences of family in the South and in the Midwest really being excluded and discriminated against in all different kinds of ways. They had the direct experience of segregation. And really in the 60s, there was still a way in which, 70s, excuse me, folks moving to cities really did so at a time when there was still great difficulty. And I'll say a few things about that really quickly. What we see in the 1970s is that Black folks have achieved a certain level of electoral power as a voting bloc because they had fought for the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 1965, which opened up the opportunity for voting in ways that they had always tried to sign up for voting, but put limits on the ways in which states and localities could resist or rain terror on those trying to vote. No more poll taxes, no more grandfather clause. We have a poll tax in Florida today. That's basically if you leave prison and you don't pay your court fees and all kinds of things, you, one, can go back to prison, but two, you won't be able to vote until those things are paid. That's called a poll tax, right? So anything that inhibits your ability to vote that is not based on citizenship issues. So that Voting Rights Act, that Civil Rights Act is passed. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 is passed. There are all the Brown v. Board is passed, desegregating education, right? And now our schools are even more segregated. So we can look at the ways in which the civil rights movement, in all of its achievements, have not achieved the kind of liberation and equality that folks are fighting for. And the terror backlash on civil rights leaders means that folks are thinking about more than just participation in the society. They're thinking this society is unjust and maybe we need to think about creating our own organizations instead of trying to assimilate into these organizations because they are unjust. And they were in many ways, thinking about both economic development of Black communities and protection, right? So my parents, again, moved to upstate New York, where I was born. In that time, again, based on this incredible backlash and violence associated with the civil rights movement, people are thinking, we need to have our own intellectuals, we need to have our own communities, we need to have our knowledge, we need to be included because people are thinking we have nothing to offer. And so we need to develop those things. Black folks are participating in consciousness raising and thinking about how do we build knowledge, how do we build tell our children the stories of our lives, that we're included in our own narrative, right? There's an incredible Black feminist movement afoot of Black women saying we are Black folks too, and we've got to think about these gender issues in addition to us as sort of raced bodies and raced people. And really, I want to talk about the Black Power movement, the Black Panther Party, other organizations, and how they were thinking about not just self-defense and protection, but about food justice. It was about mutual aid. And if we can't depend on our government to do what it says and to provide for its citizens, how do we provide for one another, right? How do we make sure that everyone in our community is fed, right? That's when the Black Panther Party really became a threat to the United States, is the breakfast program, right? And you can see all of the notes from the FBI. Now we have all of that information from COINTELPRO and the ways in which these organizations that were seeking for protection and mutual aid and to build up the capacity of Black communities to live on a very basic level and then to protect themselves on the level after that. Their 10-point program was really about education and food and housing and all these sort of human needs. The federal government saw that as a threat, right? if these folks can do for each other what we're supposed to be doing, this is a threat to national security. So they infiltrated the Black Panther Party and other Black Power organizations. They incarcerated folks, they murdered folks, and in many ways, we can look at the ways in which they made it possible, right, for folks to, for the spread of drugs into these communities. And this is all documented. It is not a conspiracy theory, right? So here we have the breakfast program from the Black Panthers. And here, this has become a pretty famous photo of the Black Panther Party in Seattle when they're asked to be recruited into the police force in Seattle. And they're asking questions about, you know, do we want to be included into a system that is disproportionately oppressing and dominating us and killing us? Or do we want to think about creating something new in this place? So that was the central question, I think, of that time. So where was I? I was a kid. There's me in the middle, my two siblings in upstate New York growing up. I was a little kid. Again, here's what's happening in the 70s in cities. The federal government is now disinvesting in cities. So it used to be that cities like Philadelphia got 50% of their budget from the federal government. When the 70s hit, you have Black folks moving into cities disproportionately, white folks moving out. That wasn't a set of individual preferences, right? The federal government invested in suburbs. Through the GI Bill, they made it possible for white folks to use the GI Bill to move into suburbs, right? How does the federal government do that? It disproportionately gives mortgage benefits to white GIs and not to Black folks. It disproportionately redlines Black neighborhoods so that you can't get a mortgage to live in a Black neighborhood, and the realtors and others steer you away from white neighborhoods, right? So the federal government invests in white folks moving into the suburbs. It's not an individual preference. The federal government invests in the interstate highway system, right? Which makes it possible to get out of cities and to live in suburbs and to work in cities, and harder to live in the city and get out to the suburbs if you're trying to make a different kind of commute. It's the suburbanization of jobs. So the federal government offers all kinds of incentives to companies to build their office parks in the suburbs and not in cities. Part of that is the infrastructure in cities. It was too expensive to tear things down, but that's an investment the federal government has to make in its cities, right? But it says we're going to invest in the suburbs. Factories move to the south, and the government facilitates white flight. The economic shift in the nation at that time is deindustrialization. Philadelphia and Chester and areas around it were known for to be factory towns where folks could have a good middle-class job at a high school, buy a house, have kids, all of those things. Those middle-class jobs are gone. When the nation deindustrialized and we moved from a manufacturing economy to a service economy, we have a high-end economy and a low-end economy. Most folks who are in that low-end economy are not making enough to live on, and the high-end folks are increasing their wages more and more, and we exacerbate inequality even as we remove the possibility of living in the middle class. The federal government does this by subsidizing the building of factories elsewhere, outsourcing labor to other countries, and automation. We just don't need human beings to do these jobs anymore, right? Philadelphia is known for non-durable goods like hosiery and Stetson hats, apparel, textiles. And so these are things, right? No one wears nylon hosiery or silk hosiery anymore. So those things are completely not necessary. I mean, when's the last time you saw someone wear stockings, right? So some of these goods are just no longer in demand. So it's all of these things happening at once. It's a terrible storm of populations moving in who have less education, and a city that just can't meet the demand for jobs, right? There's a spatial mismatch. So the newest jobs are now in the suburbs, right? But they're jobs that are either very high-end skill set with an education that most folks don't have access to, or low-end. There's a skills mismatch and a spatial mismatch. And then, of course, we still have the impacts of racial residential segregation, and Black governance of cities happens just as a city loses its tax base. So the people who make the most money at jobs in Philadelphia, at Chester, do not live in Philadelphia or Chester. So they take their taxes and they go to another municipality and build that up. Does that make sense? Okay. I'm going to keep going quickly. So what were my parents doing in the late 70s, right? This is them at an Urban League economic event. And so many folks who were part of the civil rights movement, Black Power movements, are really, again, in the late 70s, turn of the 80s, really thinking about economic development, right? This is when there's a terrible recession in the late 70s, and folks are really thinking about how do we save our communities? How do we fight for our communities? These wonderful gentlemen are the architects of mass incarceration. It starts with Nixon, who says, hey, all this civil disobedience, these people are not political agents making demands on the system to live into their promises to their citizens. These people are lawless and they're scary and we need to lock them up. In the 1970s, scholars were arguing that we didn't need prisons because they weren't effective. Crime was on a secular decline then, like it has been in the last 20 years now. And people were saying prisons are obsolete. We don't need them. We got to make a different system because we don't need them and they're not helpful. And Richard Nixon says, no, we need to expand the prison system. We need law and order, right? Because it isn't that these people are making righteous demands on the system. It is disorder. It is lawlessness. They are criminals who are asking too many questions and making too many demands. Again, just the demands themselves require a backlash. So that was continued under Reagan, the war on drugs. That was continued under Bush with the war on drugs, and that's Gerald Ford also who continued the work of Nixon. So we see from 1971 to 2012, 800% change, 800% increase in the prison population. That is not meeting a demand for more crime, but is in fact more punitive with longer sentences, right? For drug use, which is a public health issue and not a crime, right? There are all these ways in which the war on drugs disproportionately impacted communities of color. And once again, people knew that, right? This is an old photo of people protesting the war on drugs and saying, this is impacting our communities. It is unfair. It is unequal. It is violent. It is about social control. It is a war on the poor. It is a war on Black folks. It's a war on us, right? So once again, people are resisting, people are protesting. And what they got was not a concession, even in this case. The concession was sort of rhetoric around, this is not unfair, these people are super predators, right? Remember the term super predators? Well, these are our dear friends, the Democrats, right? So we don't want to pretend as if this is a one-party issue, right? Democrats and Republicans trade off on maintaining white supremacy and hierarchy in this country. And it was the greatest expansion of the prison system in history was under Clinton, the 1994 crime bill, and the militarization of the police that we see now. So all of those tear gas bombs and tanks and military style weapons that are used by the police happened under the Democrats, And so again, we see how many people are incarcerated, right? And not just incarcerated, but under the supervision of the state. In a city like Chicago, 55% of Black men over 18 are under the supervision of the state. That means they're in prison, on parole or probation, right? Which means they are, in Pennsylvania alone, there are 826 things you cannot do or be, 826, if you have a felony conviction. You can't be a barber, ever. Right, there are professional licenses that you can't get based on a felony conviction, which means there is no re-entry, right? There is no way to come back from a prison sentence if there are 826 things you cannot do. The other part of the dismantling of the gains, right, that Black people made is not just the war on drugs and the expansion of the prison system and the demands of the prison system and the ways in which it replaced for many white working class folks, the manufacturing jobs they used to have are now in the carceral system, which means we have to keep it full, right, is the dismantling of the social safety net, right, that happened also under Clinton. The end of welfare as we know it. It goes to state block grants, right? Which means poverty is exacerbated, right? The leg up that people might have used in a country where you can't make enough money on a job, right? Means now you have no support from the government. You can receive welfare benefits for 5 years if you have children and no more after that. Again, the decimation of the social safety net without income and jobs to replace it, right? So again, here we're talking about the 80s and 90s. where was I? Well, I went to college, right? My parents were still doing the work that they were doing. And I was in college. And so at the time that I was in college, one of the biggest questions that was before the Supreme Court, which is back before the Supreme Court now, was affirmative action, right? There were lots of questions when I was in college about whether we as Black students were fit to be there, if we were just tokens, if we had gotten in because of affirmative action, because people fundamentally misunderstood what it was. It was part of the civil rights bills, and it was signed by Lyndon Johnson. It's an executive order that is not quotas. It is just that institutions that are federally funded, that have federal contracts, must take affirmative action to not discriminate, right? And even though the Black population at my institution when I went was 6 or 7%, people still felt that was too much, and that we were taking slots from people who should have been there, which says a lot about what people think of intellectual capacity, all kinds of things, right? So we weren't overrepresented, still very much underrepresented, but even that was too much. So while we were at college, there were a lot of debates and bomb threats in the dorm I lived in, all kinds of things about Black folks. And what I mostly found at college was drugs. And what wasn't happening there was the kind of policing that happens in Black neighborhoods. Rampant drug use, rampant drug buying, rampant drug selling, all on the part of college students at an elite university. So while I was in college, my cousin was incarcerated for the very same thing that most of my classmates were doing every night, all night. So again, racial inequality is not just about racial terror, right, and exclusion. It's also about differential consequences for the same behavior. And what the war on drugs did was penalize in such long-lasting punitive ways communities of color for using and doing the same things that every other person is doing, right? Drug use is consistent across class, across race, across gender, across sexuality, etc. It is the same. All communities use drugs. Why is it, right, that these communities are disproportionately arrested and adjudicated for the same things? When my classmates were getting high every night, most nights, and they weren't arrested or adjudicated, but my cousin was. And he was arrested here and adjudicated here at the Mississippi State Penitentiary, Parchman. So the reason I raise that is because it brings us full circle. My grandmother, my great-great-grandmother was enslaved on the same ground that my cousin was incarcerated. And that is what white supremacy is in the United States. That is what systemic racism is. It is maintaining groups of color at the bottom of the racial hierarchy by federal, state, and local policy. So what does 2020 look like? What's different is we're looking at Philando Castile, Trayvon Martin, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Eric Garner, Sandra Bland, Ahmaud Arbery, all victims of the same kind of legal and extra-legal violence that we saw in 1919, that we saw pre-20th century, that we saw mid-20th century, late 20th century, and now into the 21st century. And now people have cameras. And what stories can be circulated are made different by the fact that footage is taken, right? You can dismiss a story from Black folks who say this is what happened, and you can tell that story however you want, narrate it however you want, and it's clear to me in 2020 you can do the same, right? And still, though you see someone executed, murdered on camera, you can still tell a different story about it. But not everybody will listen. And so you see a real resistance to this kind of violence against Black folks in 2020. And what's interesting about it is, I want to draw your attention to this sign in this particular protest this summer that says, "I can't believe I'm still protesting this in 2020. My mother and my aunts and the elders in my family keep saying this feels so familiar. Donald Trump's rhetoric feels so familiar. And this summer, the protests weren't just happening in the US. This is a protest that was in Australia, this upper picture. And so folks around the world were responding to it. So how do we change things? We have to know and understand our history. We have to understand how federal, state, and local policy works on all these issues. We have to look at the ways in which public and private interests collude to maintain the social system the way it is, to maintain racial hierarchy and white supremacy. We have to understand the social, political, economic conditions. We have to understand that folks are constantly resisting and fighting and doing exactly what America says to make it, and are still excluded and repressed. We have to understand policy and practice. We have to ask different questions. Instead of asking questions that justify our social order, we have to ask, what would it take for us all to have what we need to thrive, right? What would it take for all of us to have housing, healthcare, education? We can all have that in a nation this wealthy. We have to ask, what would it take for us to do that? And how do we get there? Instead of asking, why doesn't this person do that? Or couldn't they have obeyed? Or couldn't they have complied? Or couldn't this outcome have been different? This outcome should not even be among the options, right? There shouldn't be this level of inequality. And if I had my way, there would be no inequality. We would all have what we need. And I want to encourage us to get on that page. We have to value other human beings. We have to call for a massive redistribution of resources. I think we always stop short there. We have to redistribute resources, and we have to think about both long-term changing in our systems and short-term harm reduction. How do we keep more people alive in the short term so that they can thrive in the long term, right? How do we not build our systems that require human suffering, like prison systems, in order for people to thrive? What can we do as individual folks? We can be in community with each other. We can identify the issues and challenges in our communities. We can identify our own gifts and talents, right? You know, for us to change things, we got to feel nurtured. We got to have joy. And so we can't be an accountant that helps everybody if our gifting is really as a poet, right? And vice versa, right? I always tell my students, whatever gifts you have, you got to use your time, talent, and resources for the things that you care about most, right? The things that move you, that you say, I can't live with that, right? We have to be in community with each other, because we can't change things on our own, right? The lone wolf doesn't work. We got to be working together and in community. That means we really have to listen to each other. We have to rest, and we have to choose joy, because we got to smile. We got to have joy in this life. We got to have a reason to keep going. We can't just deconstruct, but we got to construct something beautiful in its place so that we can all have the lives we deserve. You can't earn access to fresh water and fresh air and food and education and housing. That's something every human being deserves. Healthcare, these are rights, right? So I think if we move in that way, we can make it. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you very much. You've given us an efficient history in an efficient manner, covering sort of where we are and how we got there. And it's really nice of you and contextual to use your family to give us a picture of that. I want to just open this up for questions or comments that people might have, folks might have for Nina while she wets her throat, having talked all this time. Let's just jump right in. If you have a question. Oh, and of course, thank you for sharing. See some messages, chat messages there. All right, anyone, there's a lot of handles, a lot of places to sort of plug in and maybe ask some questions or get some more information or just to comment. Now's the time.
What do you think about judges and their role, and prosecutors and their role in the racial inequalities in our criminal justice system?
I think they're huge. You know, I think the other part of the war on drugs was about mandatory minimums, moving discretion away from judges and into the hands of prosecutors, so that our prosecutors get to decide how long you're going to be in prison based on what they charge you with. And Pennsylvania is particularly punitive in that we have murder 2 and murder 3, which are you didn't participate in harming anyone, and or let's say you rob someone and you hit them in the head with, let's say, you know, an object, right? Which isn't a fatal blow by any stretch. But they die 2 weeks later based on an underlying condition, right? And or they have a heart attack. I can name 2 specific cases where the person is so nervous and so stunned by a robbery that they, without a weapon, that they have a heart attack and die. That is murder 2, and that is life without parole in Pennsylvania. So you will die in prison. There's no possibility of parole, and in Pennsylvania, it's life without parole. So in part, like if the prosecutor charges you with these things and you're found guilty, the judge has no wiggle room to say, okay, you're 16, there was no intention here to harm anyone, this person just died, I'm going to give you 25 years or 15 years, or there's no wiggle room for that. So I think DAs and judges actually have, judges have very little discretion, and DAs have ultimate discretion in what they charge folks with and how they end up in prison. I mean, one of the good things that the Supreme Court did recently was to end juvenile life sentences. Pennsylvania has more juvenile life sentences, juvenile lifers who are now being resentenced than I think most other states, and Philadelphia has the most in Pennsylvania. So Philadelphia has the most in Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania is one of the top 3 in the country for juvenile life sentences. And part of that is a few things. One, in the out counties, upper parts of Pennsylvania, there's not enough population for there to be a state representative unless there's a prison there. The people who are incarcerated cannot vote, but they are counted for numbers. So now areas of the state have a state representative they wouldn't otherwise have. So there's no incentive to decarcerate. There's more incentive to keep people in prison. The vast majority of people incarcerated in these out counties are people from Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and they're Black and Latinx people, mostly Black. So our population is drawn from cities that would have more political sway in the state, that often go blue in a red state. And so prison gerrymandering means you have all these people that count as population who cannot vote. And the cities are losing their population of voters because people are being incarcerated and disenfranchised. And so all of these counties would also have no other industry. The agricultural industry is decimated in Pennsylvania. And so the only jobs available at SCI Forest in that area of the state are prison jobs, right? And because people are, people who are now, and we're seeing higher rates of incarceration now in those out counties based on methadone and methamphetamines and that drug business. And people who are incarcerated in those areas or from those areas, they have to be put in solitary confinement because they know everybody who works at the prison, right? There are all these ways in which DAs and prosecutors, one, are elected, but that means they maintain the system because it benefits them and it benefits the state. And until those incentives are no longer there, we can't decarcerate, we can't change the system. And so in Philadelphia, people really organize, incarcerated people organize their communities, their family members to vote for Larry Krasner, who really was about decarceration, right? And he has to be held to that standard. We still have to organize and fight. It's not enough to elect people. You know, we have to organize and hold his feet to the fire for the things that he promised. And I think that's important because again, if we really cared about drug crime, we would go right to Swarthmore. My students do drugs all the time. We would go right to Penn and arrest all those people if we really cared about drug crime. But we don't care about drug crime. We care about maintaining the prison population. When they built SCI Phoenix, the governor promised, who was then, not Wolf, but the person before him, and I'm blocking him out mentally, I guess, because I can't remember, but said, we're going to fill this prison. And they built extra space and said, we will fill it. Why would you make that kind of promise? Anyway, I'm going to stop. Thank you for that question, Susan.
Rendell, right? Was it Rendell or Ridge?
It was, say that again?
Rendell or Ridge?
Ridge.
I have one more thing to say, and that is if you're interested in being active to make the prison situation in Delaware County more humane, there's an organization called Delco Coalition for Prison Reform, and I'll put the link in the chat. They're on Facebook, and I've worked with them, and they're getting the private company out of the county prison, which is another issue.
George Hill.
You could talk about, yes, GEO Corporation, which also does the immigration detention. So even just to educate yourself, it's a good thing. So I'm going to put that in the chat.
Thank you.
Anyone else have a question?
I just wanted, Nina, I just wanted to say thank you very much for the presentation. I think it was wonderful the way you have woven in, you know, the family history to the key events for 150 years. It really brings some things home. Thank you.
My pleasure. I feel like I spend all my time talking about racial inequality, and I feel like it's so, one, it's so abstract the ways we've treated each other in the United States. It just feels so, when you hear one thing after the next, it can kind of become so overwhelming that it's abstract. And so I really wanted to say, no, here are human beings. Like, here's how I have felt it and experienced it with people who are alive in my own family, you know? And so I appreciate your openness to that, because it's something new I just tried for this talk. And so thank you. I'm glad it wasn't distracting or anything. So thank you for that.
No, thank you for that. I have a question. What advice do you have for us as an organization who the staff is predominantly white and the student body is predominantly Black and brown, as far as when we're trying to explore issues of how to deal with systemic racism? Do you have any recommendations? And hopefully this will be the beginning of a relationship between DCLC and you as advising us, but so you don't have to give a sort of complete answer right now, but just a few things that we can sort of chew on and reflect on.
Yeah, so I would say that I often find a few things. One, and I work in a lot of different organizing communities. I work, the think tanks that I'm a part of at Chester and Graterford are half incarcerated folks and half outside folks, and we're all scholars and teachers. And I think part of it is believing that inequality, folks at the bottom of the hierarchy are deficient in their thinking, in their knowledge, in how they understand the world. And I think that's the main thing I often see. Like, when we work with incarcerated folks, people often think I'm there to teach them. And like, I'm a volunteer and it's so sweet that I go in there and do things. And that is not the case. They have a fuller understanding of mass incarceration, its policies and its impacts than the people on the outside. So we have to lift up the knowledge of our young people. We have to, they don't know the history because they're not going to learn it in schools. I think it's upon us who work with them to know the history, so we can say, actually, this thing that's happening in your neighborhood has a long history and it comes from state, federal, and local policy, right? Because Black folks are socialized into white supremacy too. So you hear us saying, we can't get it together, you know, if we would just act right. And I'm like, no. People on the top don't act right. Don't tell me the Kardashians act right, right? They're not rewarded with wealth because they act right, right? Donald Trump doesn't act right, right? It isn't a behavioral issue. This is how systemic racism works. And I think that's important for us to tell them in the most honest way, in the most honest way. And then to always be hopeful. I am so full of hope because there's so many young people that I teach and who I'm in community with who are like, we are not gonna let this slide. We are gonna fight. And as long as we have an ethic that says we are not going to, in our conversations, in our work, in our community organizing, we're not gonna exclude LGBTQI folks. We're not gonna exclude undocumented folks. Like, we're gonna start with the most vulnerable among us, right? Race is one aspect, but there are several others. And we gotta be thinking about how to create a society where nobody is without what they need. And I think being honest with them about that, about poverty and its impacts, right? And what's possible for them, right? All of these things are true. And you are fearfully and wonderfully made. And there's something that you can be and do that only you can be and do based on your gifts and talents. And I'm doing everything I can to help you get there, even with all of this. Right? I mean, that's the real beauty of it, is that we have survived all of this. And I think those lessons are really important. So I'll stop there. But this is just the beginning. Email me. You know, Swarthmore is down the street from wherever y'all are in Delaware County. I live in the city, but I'm always in Chester at Chester Prison. Now we can't go because of the pandemic, but you know, I'm always there. We're in the think tank every Tuesday night. So I'm available. I'm in community with you. You know, now that we're all on the same page and we're all in this together, like call me, email me.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that hope. That hope piece is important because you can get weary, tired, cynical, trying to fight for against systemic racism. All right, maybe thank you. Anyone have just one last question or comment?
I might. It's been hard to kind of put my thoughts together here, but because there's so much. I think most of us here, not everyone, but most of us here we teach immigrants or support them in some way. And we are working on curriculum to try to teach them about systemic racism. But I also think we don't want our work to feel like the flavor of the moment. Like we've never taught about systemic racism before. At least it wasn't a part of my practice. And I think maybe one way to teach it and make it relevant is to make it personal, but also give a lead to a course of action. So, in your opinion, what issues do you think we should be thinking about taking courses of action on or educating our students on when it comes to immigrants? Yeah,
so I would say really clearly, like the history of immigration in the United States is a racial project. Pre-World War II immigration, post-World War II immigration, the expansion of the category of white to include Irish and Jewish and Italians who weren't formally considered white, how that process happened, and the ways in which the 1962 Hart-Celler Act, that Immigration Act, what it included, what it expanded, and why it wasn't initially meant for East Asian immigrants, but how it was used, and how that same, the categories of who was allowed to come based on skill set, based on education, based on the amount of capital they had coming here, and based on the amount of their ability to have connections in the United States meant that people were primed to come here who had a certain education level, right? And so what does that do to racial hierarchy? How do we understand the model minority myth that really applies to Korean, Japanese, and Chinese immigrants that does not apply to and completely erases Southeast Asian migration to the United States, people who had refugee status after the Vietnam War, during and after the Vietnam War, the Hmong population. I mean, there are ways in which all of this is racialized, and the ways in which we talk about immigration now in the face of it, excuse me, are Mexican and South American immigrants, when that is not the fullness of the immigrant population. There are Black immigrants who have been in detention centers over 2 years, and we don't talk about Black migration at all. And so how is it that this whole discussion of immigration policy is racialized? And the face of it means that it's possible for us to separate children from their parents based on who we see as the face of immigration. Berks is very close. That's a detention center that's open. That's a way to talk about race. Michelle, I'm forgetting her last name, has a documentary called La Madres de Berks.
Yes.
That's all about mothers and children there. I think that's a great film to show young folks who have migrated to the US. So I think there's so many ways you can do it. And there's so many great organizations to partner with, be it LEAD, Juntos. I mean, there's so many, the AFRICOM in West Philly. These are all like immigrant organizations that deal with particular racial categories, but are all like allied and coalesced together. The folks who migrated from Puerto Rico and how they're treated like immigrants, and they're US citizens, right? I mean, there's a huge Puerto Rican population in North Philly. Anyway, I'll stop. But I think you can really talk about immigration as a racial issue.
Thank you. I'll probably email you for some of those organizations that you mentioned. Thank you, though.
Sure.
Okay. All right, listen, thank you. Thank you very much. Give you a round of applause. Thank you very much for your time and your energy and your knowledge. And I want to just thank you. So this will be the beginning of our continuation, because I've been in conversation with you before of a relationship and trying to struggle for justice. Okay?
Yes, and let me
Yes.
just say, we can achieve a better world,
Mhm.
and we can be free with each other. And that's how we create that new world, is how we treat one another, right? That really matters if we're in community with each other. So it's possible, it's here. Let's love on each other. Let's do this together. I'm in it with you guys. Have a great day.
Appreciate it. Thank you. You have a good nice day and weekend too. Thank you now. Blessings. Okay.